Hi class, welcome to lecture for Tuesday, September 8th. And today we are in chapter 2 talking about the sociological theory and research methods. So I will just briefly give an overview, and then I definitely want to direct you to Nicole's videos this week, Crash Course in Sociology number 3 and 4. They're pretty quick, but she's pretty engaging, and so I would love for you to watch her videos and then in the discussion talk about something that stood out to you from the lecture or one of her videos, and we'll review that in a minute. But if you have your text, we are in chapter 2 in the second edition. That's on page 14 and 15. We'll start there. So the thing about sociology is it's a way of looking at the world. It's a perspective. And so sociology has three main perspectives that sociologists use to look at the world and make sense of what's happening in the world. So really briefly, the main ones you need to know, and it's actually a very helpful time based on world events to look at what's going on in the world through these perspectives. So it'll be really interesting as we learn about these to look at it through the lens of what's going on in our current world today. So, okay, the first one is the structural functional perspective. And this looks at society in a way as society is held together. How does it stay together? We have some systems in place like churches and the school system and the government that for the most part keep society running and functioning. That can be debated right now, especially with current events, but for the most part, the structural functionalist looks at society as a structure that is highly functioning, and they want to know what are the systems in place that keep it running and keep it going. The second one, and this is moving on to page 17, is the social conflict perspective. So this is where you may have heard the name Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was a believer in the social conflict perspective, conflict theory, and he believed that everything that happens in society is as a result of conflict. So he believed that the rich took advantage of the poor and the powerful took advantage of the marginalized, and that change would come about when the poor or marginalized people would rise up against the powerful and wealthy. Social conflict theory, though, it kind of has a negative connotation, but actually conflict theory is very important in looking at change. So if you think about a really poignant current event right now, which would be the murder of George Floyd, that is a perfect example of conflict theory, how conflict is necessary to produce social change. And we've seen on the news how people have come together, people have risen up, and they have started the Black Lives Matter movement, all in response to essentially a power struggle that ended in a murder of an innocent person. So conflict can be destructive to society when it's not managed effectively. And I think we're seeing on the news examples where some Black Lives Matter protests are very helpful in bringing about change, but rioting and destroying property and hurting other people is not very effective for long-term change. So if you want to look at society with the conflict theory lens, you would look at it like that. Like conflict has to come about in order for change to happen. So think about some current events or think about past historical events that started with conflict and where they ended up. And think about some current ones right now and where you think they might go and some of those events that were born out of tension. Okay, and then briefly, the last perspective is the interactionist perspective. Now, I want to note something sort of important, which is the first two theories, structural functionalist and conflict theory, are ways of looking at the bigger picture world. And then we move up to the interactionist perspective, and that's on a micro level, which is looking at the world from a smaller view, and it looks at the interactions between people. So for instance, how do people talk to each other? How do people dress? What are the symbols we use and the gestures we use to communicate as a people, as a culture? And so the interactionist perspective looks at society through the lens of individual, smaller relationships, whereas the other two look at the world on a larger scale and what's going on a global scale. So those are very brief, and you can read more about them in chapter 2, but I like how the book summarizes the difference between them. It says on page 20, the structural functionalist looks at how society is held together. The conflict theorist looks at how the world is falling apart. And the interactionist theorist looks at individual interactions between people on a smaller scale. So again, that was a very simplistic way of explaining those theories, and you can see Nicole explain them in a little bit different way. They can be a little bit difficult to grasp, so I just made them really simple and short, but watch her videos and see if you pick up something more or something else that interests you. She gives some great examples. So now we're going to move into the second part of this lecture, and we're going to talk about something that's related to your discussion post this week. And actually, let's go into that right now, and it's going to be steps in doing sociological research. Now, you're not going to do an actual research project this semester. You are going to research something, but we're not going to go out into the community and do it. And so if you go to page 20, starting on page 20 in the second edition of the book, we're going to talk about the 6 steps of doing sociological research. How do sociologists study these problems, these events, these interactions? How do they study it with science behind it? So I want to take you to, you can check out some of these links here. I want to point out where I am under lessons in Populi. So chapter 2, the theory and methods, you can look at the PowerPoints if you want. And then down here are the links to Nicole's videos. And then also the ProQuest database link is in here too if you want to look up articles related to your research later. That's how you can do that. And I want to pop over here to the discussion just so you can be thinking about it while we talk. But if we go to discussion post week 2, you are going to pick a topic from the lecture, what I'm talking about, or one of Nicole's videos, what stood out to you, and then summarize why it interested you, and then add some of your own thoughts to that conversation, and do that in about one to 2 paragraphs. And then the second part, you are going to pick a topic, you are going to create a hypothesis, which we'll talk about how to do in a minute, and you are going to design a scientific way to test this hypothesis. Now, you're not going to get very, very detailed about this. We're just doing kind of a high-level overview, but I put some suggested topics there. They also are included in your book, and the book has some more topics, or you can choose your own. But the point is you're going to take a really general topic like why adults return to school, or why marriages break up, and we are going to turn it into a researchable question. Those are really, really big topics. So if you were to say to someone, like a sociologist were to ask, why do marriages break up? Well, where do they even start with that? How do they even study that? There could be 1,000,001 reasons. So they need to turn that topic of interest, that social problem, something they want changed, something they want to learn more about, they need to turn that into a researchable question. So when you're selecting a researchable problem, the book gives some good examples. What's important to you? What do you think needs to be changed in the world? What is currently happening, and why is it in need of change? So you can ask yourself those questions and then come up with something that interests you. And then you can even use one of these topics, and then we have to ask ourselves, how do I research that? How do I narrow it down? So step 2 would be, how do I formulate a testable hypothesis? If I want to look at why marriages break up, I might narrow that into a hypothesis of marriages that occur between people that are below the poverty line end in divorce more times than those who are in the middle to upper ranges of income. So I take that why marriages break up, and then I narrow it down into a researchable hypothesis, and I ask that question. And then I've got to design a scientific way to test this. So how am I going to find that out? So if you go to page 22 and 23, it talks about ways I can find this out. So how would you get answers to those questions in a scientific manner? Well, I might decide to survey people. I might decide to survey people online or in my community, or I may look at some existing statistics and demographics online, and I might run some statistical tests on that data to figure out, are people in this income range more likely to divorce than people in these other income ranges? So then I've got to figure out, how do I answer that? Who do I ask? Who is going to be my sample population? Do I want to do questionnaires? Do I want to go and directly observe somebody at the park or at the mall? So if I think about my question about marriage, I'm probably not going to be able to answer my question by doing direct observation. It's more of a question that's going to be answered through surveys and questionnaires, asking people, what's your income level? How long have you been married? Have you been divorced? And those types of things. So you got to think about, once I ask my question, what is the best way for me to figure out how to get the data I need to answer my question? So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So be creative, and the chapter will help give you some ideas on how you can do that: questionnaires, surveys, direct observation, participant observation, looking at existing data. So just go through that and then talk about, how would I collect this data? And what do I need to consider? Like, what would my sample population be? Would it be people I know? Would it be people in another state? Would it be people in another country? Would it be a random sample of different people in different states around the country? Or do I want to study particularly the Tri-Cities or Seattle? So think about, if I was going to ask this question, how would I turn it into something that I could get those answers? And that's what your post is going to be on. Okay, so if you have any questions, make sure you reach out to me and let me know. And just make sure that you remember that your discussion post will be due by Thursday at 11:59 p.m. And then remember, by Sunday, you have to respond to 2 of your peers, and you can see the questions that you need to answer when you are responding to your peers right here. And if you need to upload anything, you can definitely do it right there in Populi. So pretty easy. And please let me know if I can be of any assistance.